Thank you so much, Leslie. That was an over-generous introduction, but much appreciated. And thank you all very much for coming here and for zooming in, if you're zooming. It's really, really nice, as Leslie said, to be back actually talking to people. I think the talking to the black screen has been quite tiring. And of course, there's that awful moment when you have to click the red button and it all disappears. And then you're left in the dark thinking, oh, that wasn't very good. I made a mistake there. What a shame. So it's very much nicer to have the questions in person, and I look forward to that. Now, my title stems from research into the history of Ravenna during the 5th to 8th centuries, which forced me to reconsider the identity commonly given to the historical period called Late Antiquity. And as a result of this work, I now wish to propose that it should be understood as early Christendom, rather than the familiar notion of a late aspect of antiquity. As I set out in my preface to the formation of Christendom, all periods have layers of residual, dominant, and emergent features. And this period, from about 400 to 800, followed from classical antiquity and was shaped by it. But the shaping energies across those centuries were an attempt to leave behind paganism and to create new Christian societies. Out with the old and in with the new, as Bishop Neon said in Ravenna. Because his name was Neon, he was always very keen on the new. This evening I would like to examine these issues from the vantage point of Ravenna. An immediate concern is periodization. Do the centuries from roughly AD 400 to 800 constitute a distinct historical period? Yes, I think they do, and so do all the historians who use the term late antiquity, devoting new journals and conferences and series of book publications to it. It encompasses the Mediterranean world of the Roman Empire, from its official division by Theodosius I in 395, to the coronation of a Western emperor of the Romans as a clear competitor to the Eastern emperor. And in the year 800, this ruler was the Emperor Irene. It also constitutes a long transition that effectively separated Constantinople, New Rome, the imperial capital in the east, from Old Rome and Aachen, the two poles of ecclesiastical and political authority that emerged in the West. During the same period, Greek became the dominant language of the East, while Latin rose to a commanding position over many vernaculars in the West. Although Christianity had been firmly established throughout the old Mediterranean world, it was now challenged by the new revelation of Islam. And while the Seventh Ecumenical Council of Nicaea had reunited the Eastern and Western churches in 787, many dissenting currents remained, and they posed opposition to its devotion to icons. These iconoclastic tendencies continued in the East, while very critical disapproval was documented in the Libri Carolini in the West. So why not continue to use the name late antiquity? I've argued elsewhere that late antiquity reflects a backward look to antiquity, the Greco-Roman world which had achieved such unrivaled supremacy, instead of looking forward to the religious revelation of an eternal heaven to which true believers would live forever. The term early Christendom reflects the rise to dominance of Christian identity, which is paralleled by the term early Islam, to identify the final revelation of God, Allah, to the Arabs. Both signal the enormous changes that occurred in this period. Now, if I can move the screen along, a few maps just to illustrate it. These identities took many forms and were often in conflict. Judaism also remained very significant as some groups in the Yemen and later in Khazaria, north of the Black Sea, chose to convert to Old Testament beliefs. After considered evaluation of all the beliefs current in the post-Greco-Roman Mediterranean world, their leaders actively aligned themselves with the original 12 tribes of Israel. This process of choosing a monotheistic faith suggests that religious affiliation had assumed a greater importance for rulers as well as for the majority of people. The rejection of ancient gods who had been venerated in ancient Greece and Rome, and of creator gods, animal gods, divine rulers, holy mountains, trees and rivers, was often accompanied by the destruction of idols, statues of those gods, male and female. For monotheists, this was part of the insistence on belief in the one God, invisible, unrepresentable, sometimes even unnameable. Despite their variety, all three versions were directed towards the same single divinity. The older cults didn't die away immediately, and their adherents in regions beyond the sphere of dominant monotheism became the objects of missionary activity by Christian, Jewish, and Muslim leaders. This enormous change overwhelmed all other developments between 400 and 800 AD. For too long, I think, we have all been enthralled to Peter Brown's wonderful book, The World of Late Antiquity. I must emphasize that I was among those most profoundly influenced by his inspired analysis of the much larger world that included Persia and Arabia, with its invigorating scope, enhanced by powerful illustrations. Peter's book imprinted late antiquity on the whole world, a world changing and adapting to entirely novel forces, mainly non-Greco-Roman, but conscious of its inheritance from the past. The late antique label also carried a heavy burden of unsurpassable ancient achievement. In the West, non-Roman forces occupied vast provinces and established new forms of government. The local survivors adjusted, some senators becoming bishops, and tried to sustain some cultural traditions, like education in Latin. In contrast to the Western breakup of empire, in the East, Constantinople, New Rome, continued to administer a vast area in efficient imperial style. After some brutal conflicts between polytheistic and Christian figures, like the murder of Hypatia, destruction of temples, the Church adapted the ancient Greek wisdom to strengthen its power. During the 7th and 8th centuries, this empire was challenged by Slavic attacks from the north and west and Arab invasions from the south that dramatically reduced its territorial extent and resources. There was much less disruption of the older style of learning because imperial bureaus and the Church continued to need well-educated officials to administer the ecclesiastical, legal, and financial frameworks. I remind you of the wonder of Greek fire. Latin fell out of use. Homer continued to be admired and recited. Plato and Aristotle were not mere names, and philosophical, medical, mathematical, and agricultural skills were transmitted and developed. Beyond the imperial frontiers, non-Roman peoples were also drawn to the resources of the classical world preserved in Greek and Latin. Remember the Irish mastering both classical languages, or the Nubians adapting ancient artistic forms. In extending the decline of the Roman world to a much larger canvas, Peter Brown drew attention to the indisputable significance of a fundamental shift. Most historians agree that it sundered the fragmented Roman world into a new conglomeration of separate states, all recognizably post-Roman, yet differentiated according to particular traditions and linguistic developments that would end up in clearly distinguished vernaculars, and crucially, defined by religious cultures. As I researched the history of Ravenna, I found that the term late antiquity failed to capture the combination of Latin Christianity, Germanic tradition, and Roman inheritance that occurred initially under the influence and within the framework of the Mediterranean world dominated by Constantinople, say roughly between the reigns of Theodoric the Goth and Charlemagne. Theodoric, I argue, a synthesis emerged from Ravenna under this king, who had his military elite, Christian followers, but condemned as Arian heretics by the majority, and he had an immense respect for imperial administration, which he had observed as a hostage in Constantinople. This synthesis looked forward to the elimination of pagan practices and the establishment of efficient government, with an understanding of the need of toleration for different creeds. In Ravenna, there's proof of many Jewish communities. Synagogues are mentioned in the plural, and recently a Hebrew inscription discovered on an amphora. What happened in Ravenna appeared to buck the trend of decline and decay so visible in many cities and areas of the West. Reinforced from the mid-6th century by its alliance with Constantinople, Ravenna aimed to reconstruct a novel future. To construct it in the first place, sorry, not reconstruct. And I show you here the great palace chapel of King Theodoric. Specific elements of this trend may be captured by the use of a term like the late antiquity, or alternatively, the earlier Middle Ages. But the former still seems to stress a dependence on a glorious past, a rather pessimistic sense of loss, while the latter suggests something in nuce that did not have a distinct medieval presence yet. In studying the records of Ravenna's history, I discovered a much clearer sense of confidence in the notion of Christendom, a world dominated by Christian beliefs that promised an eternal life to all, not only those wealthy enough to build shrines and monuments for their post-mortem bodies, like this church. Theodoric and Amalasuintha, his daughter, permitted the construction of San Vitale by Catholic bishops. Hence the idea of early Christendom, which coexists with early Islam and the Babylonian development of Judaism. In a striking, personal and generous article on Ravenna in the Medieval Review, Shami Ghosh writes, I quote, "Something happened in this period, and by the time we get to the 9th century, elements of Romanitas had combined with other influences. It's far less easy to determine what happened. The evidence is too thin for certainty." End quote. Well, yes, very little evidence for the period survives, so it is perfectly reasonable to say something happened, even if what and how is harder to define. But it's a mistake to look for certainty or proof. This is not a reason, however, to despair or just give up. On the contrary, it is a stimulating challenge to try and assess what happened from the clues we have. I think the historian has a duty to use her imagination, always grounded and tested by the evidence. In studying the history of Ravenna in this period, I was surprised by two specific discoveries that seem to me to represent the new world of early Christendom. The first is the example of the anonymous cosmographer of Ravenna. He tells us that he composed his work in response to his brother Odo, who asked him to explain how the world was created. And he reports that, I translate, "Although I may not have been born in India, nor reared in Scotia, nor journeyed through Mauritania, neither may I have examined Scythia, or travelled through the 4 quarters of the world, yet by theoretical learning I have understood the whole world and the various peoples who live in it." Peter Brown described the way St. Augustine composed the first autobiography, aptly titled Confessions. With the cosmographer, we find a different, confident, personal voice, exploiting the freedom of local conditions to write and study in this entirely independent fashion. This may be a precondition for the emergence of a new synthesis. An unnamed figure could write a cosmography which reflected a broad awareness of the entire Mediterranean world and regions far beyond, and set his own city, Nobilissima Ravenna, at the centre. Partly because the text only survives in 13th and 14th century copies, it has been largely overlooked, although Guido of Pisa included most of it in his own book, composed in 1119. But the content of the cosmography makes clear that its author wrote at a time when the city was in close contact with the East, before 751, when the city fell to the Lombards. His research appears to have taken place in a well-resourced centre. The anonymous claims to have consulted an enormous number of books, ancient Greek, Latin, and Gothic, and maps such as the Tabula Peutingeriana, to supplement the information from earlier cosmographies, all apparently available in Ravenna. Such work can't be done in centres that lack libraries, and libraries require upkeep. Clearly, the Archbishop of Ravenna had an ecclesiastical library, and the secular government, at this time headed by the exarch appointed by Constantinople, had its own collection. There must have been considerable support from an institution, possibly monastic, that provided the expensive parchment or papyrus and inks and would not feel threatened by the outcome. Equivalent cosmographies were written elsewhere, as we shall see, but not in Rome or Constantinople, where I think the role of orthodoxy in their governing bodies had a rather firmer hand. There is another aspect to cosmographies that list all the regions and cities of the known world. They recognize differences and bring them together in a single account. Differences of language and pronunciation. As an educated Ravenatus of the 8th century, late 7th, early 8th century, the anonymous recognized Gothic, Latin, and Greek names. And we can see in earlier papyri the signatures of witnesses who used Gothic, and others from the East Mediterranean who signed in Greek, identifying themselves as Syrian or from Antioch, as silk merchants, shipowners, and argentarii, money changers. When the archaeological evidence for imports from the East is added, it's clear that Ravenna had very strong connections with the coastal ports of Gaza, Alexandria, and Antioch. Is this proof? Does it deliver certainty? I'd make no such claims. But I believe we can witness the synthesis which took place in the production as well as the content of this account of the world. The second surprise came in a reference to the collection of Ravenna papyri to the existence of a school of Greek doctors, alongside the Latin ones, and the teaching of Galen and Hippocrates in Latin translation by a certain Dr. Agnellus. Despite the difficulties of dating Agnellus's lectures, their unusual quality was clear from the record made by a student, possibly a fellow doctor, called Simplicius, who wrote down the basic content of his teaching. It survives in a 9th century copy, a palimpsest in Milan. Here it is. Thanks to the investigations of Nicoletto Palmieri and other medical specialists, we know that this Agnellus was teaching the introductory materials considered essential in the schools of Alexandria. The theatre now excavated there in Comedica has revealed rows of benches around a central place where the professor stood. All teaching was spoken, not written, sometimes recorded by a student using shorthand, and then manifested in practical operations. Agnellus refers to the removal of gallstones. When Simplicius wrote down what he heard Dr. Agnellus expound, he was following this Eastern traditional method of preserving lectures in written form. Historians of medicine now consider Ravenna the Western equivalent of Alexandria in the dissemination of ancient Greek medical expertise. The translations into Latin made in Ravenna correspond to those made into Syriac and Arabic in the East, which had such a powerful long life in the Islamic world. It's possible to see what's so special about Ravenna during this period by comparing the approach of the anonymous with that of another contemporary cosmographer. This second Cosmographia is the famous, possibly infamous, account that goes under the name of Ethicus Ister. Thanks to the exhaustive study by Michael Herrin, it's likely that this was composed in the 8th century, probably at Bobbio, in northwest Italy. Herrin calls it a farrago of science fiction, travel adventure, literary criticism, and prophecy, with just a dash of historical detail. It purports to be an account written by a pagan philosopher, which was discovered and translated by Jerome, a presbyter, and he's regularly confused with Saint Jerome. From internal references, it's clear that this text could not have been written by the 4th century church father. So Ethicus Ister, the author of this text, used Jerome as a cover for his claim about a much earlier text, allegedly by a philosopher, creating endless confusions about which authority he is citing and making claims that can only be connected with 7th and 8th century events. Ethicus quotes this Cosmographia verbatim, including its Greek and Hebrew letters, as well as an invented alphabet. And unlike the Anonymous of Ravenna, this text is preserved in numerous copies, probably because it carried the authority of Saint Jerome, and also because it included numerous descriptions of fascinatingly weird people in unknown regions and astonishing animals and plants. This is the earliest manuscript written in Freising between 775 and 800. Ethicus became extremely popular, while the Anonymous of Ravenna was not much copied. In comparing these two texts, the immediate contrast lies in their method of working. The Anonymous presents himself as an armchair cosmographer who studied texts written by philosophers. He calls all geographers philosophers. And he says their texts enshrine great wisdom. We've seen the bit where he says how he's studied everything and intellectuali doctrina imbui. He's learnt it all by this great intellectual endeavour. And his confidence that this theoretical learning would give him access to the knowledge of the world and all the people who live in it. He derived, and below you see the dedication to his brother Odo, his most dear brother. He derived this learning from the established ancient Greek authorities, Ptolemy, Herodotus, Strabo, texts in Latin and Gothic, and more recent studies like Isidore of Seville's etymologies. In addition to references to distant islands, Scanza in the extreme north, Ibernia, Scotia, and Thule, with the quotation from Virgil, he reports that Britannia is said to be in Europe. This pleases me. While he has difficulty establishing a reality for the islands that lie beyond the Roman world, his list of cities and castles in Britannia is impressive, and it actually complements the fact that we've lost the first patches of the Tabula Peutingeriana on that area, so he's very useful in that respect. Ethicus presents his author as this philosopher with a group of disciples who had visited Ceylon, the Adriatic, Cadiz, Ireland, Philae, the Brutish Islands, he calls them, the Orkneys, and Munitia, where the Kinocephali live, the dog-headed people. It's more of a travelogue, which is one of the attractions of his text, but he is a talented forger with a keen sense of satire. And he appears to have visited several libraries in Francia and Britannia to acquire texts. And since the last identifiable event noted may be the eruption of the island of Thera in the Aegean in 727, which is recorded in the chronicler Theophanes, he wrote it in the 730s, before he died probably in about 740. The second major contrast derives from the purpose of the two cosmographies. The Ravenna Anonymous composed his in response to his brother Odo, and he therefore started with the book of Genesis to account for the creation of the world, moving from the Garden of Eden in the Far East across the three main continents, Asia, Africa, and Europa, drawing on late Roman records of distant regions, the people who live in them, and other interesting features. In 4 books, he traces this history, and then he adds a 5th, which is a periclus of the Mediterranean Sea. Ethicus, on the other hand, we've jumped, sorry. Ethicus invents this pagan philosopher who travels around debating with other scholars and using sophisticated riddles with Greek and Hebrew letters. I haven't got a page with the Greek and Hebrew letters, but they are quite astonishing when you get to them. This type of text would appeal to 8th century readers who recognized ancient Greek culture as superior to their own and might appreciate the jokes in the text, with allusions to many strange and unfamiliar places. A third major contrast is that the Anonymous of Ravenna knew that the earth was formed of zones, from the very cold in the north and the very hot in the south, with the habitable zone along the meridian between them. The earth floated on the ocean that surrounded all the continents and formed the most distant feature of the universe. Ethicus, however, believed that the heavens above and hell below the earth were held in places by great hinges. Both agreed about the existence of the vast ocean, but Ethicus thought this required huge ramparts to hold in all the water. 2 portals, set in the east and the west, were gates in these fortifications through which the sun enters at dawn and exits at dusk. Both texts, however, share one particular problem. It was a serious issue for all cosmographers. Where does the sun go at night? How does it get back to its place in the east, whence it will rise again on the next day? Ethicus supports the theory that the sun retraces its steps along a southern path, whereas the Anonymous of Ravenna thinks that it turns to the Arctic regions of the far north, the Partem Arctorum, where it can't be seen. This theory is laid out in verses written by a certain Regalinus that are attached to the text. You see them here. These verses may not be satisfactory, but they do make sense of the daily passage of the sun across the sky, revolving around the earth. And both texts ignore the idea of the other celebrated flat earther, Cosmas Antiquity, that the sun goes to hide behind extremely high mountains and thus returns to the east. Of course, Cosmas, who sailed to India, lived in the mid-6th century and wrote in Greek. From his base in Alexandria, he claimed to have visited Ceylon and the Far East. In the 7th century, his text was partially translated into Latin in England, and Ethicus appears to have read it. The Ravenna cosmographer doesn't cite it explicitly, but argues against its notion of high mountains. He says, "Where in Scripture do we read anything about such high mountains? They don't exist, and the theory put forward in Regalinus' verses is much more convincing. But here's the huge mountain which hides the sun at night." It's interesting that even Isidore Seville's great encyclopedic work, the Etymologies, which is used by both authors, could not fathom the problem of the sun's disappearance. I quote, "The sun goes to the west and plunges itself into the ocean, and it travels unknown paths under the earth, and once again runs back to the east." In other details, Isidore presents clear observations about how the sun moves under its own power, doesn't turn with the universe, but keeps its own course, thus changing the length of days and nights and ordering the seasons. But the idea that night is the sun under the earth was not taken up by either of the 8th century cosmographers. And here you see a palimpsest of the text of Isidore written over Mansell Bible text in Greek. For the Ravenna Anonymous, previous descriptions of the universe based on older lists of all the known regions, peoples, rivers, mountains, and cities were an important source. This brings me to a recent unexpected delight, a discovery which helps to imagine what his own text looked like. Here I'll have to admit that it was Twitter where I found it. I never thought I would. Thanks to Charles West in Sheffield, who posted it, I found a Mundi Scriptura, a description of the world probably composed in the late 5th, early 6th century. This copy, written in a very neat hand, is dated to the early 8th and may have been produced in the monastery at Bobbio. It could well have been one of the sources on which the Cosmographer of Ravenna drew. After noting the traditional tripartite division of the world into Asia, Africa, and Europa, which you see visible at the top right, Asiam, Europam, et Africam, on the top line, it opens with the eastern part of the ocean with 22 rivers, including the 4 that proceeded from the east, not called Eden, and 51 gentes of great variety. Byzantium is elsewhere identified as Constantinopolis, the city of Constantine, I quote, previously called Antus, a reference to Anthusa, the Nike, the statue that was stolen from Old Rome and taken to New Rome. Although this is a copy of an earlier text, it was made at the time when the Anonymous of Ravenna was active. His own original Cosmographia would have been contemporary with this work of the early 8th century and could have looked like a Mundi Scriptura. And here the recent re-edition of another text, definitively written in Ravenna at about this time, provides additional reference to the local Scriptorium. This newly published fragment was written in a small format suitable for private use in a clear brown ink on parchment and contains part of a sermon and the beginning of a copy of the sayings of the Desert Fathers, Vitas Patrum. These stories, endlessly retold and elaborated at every retelling, were always popular due to miraculous elements. For example, the lions who buried the holy man when he died, and then they died at his side. They were all 3 found together. The new edition by Gabriele Sarti has opened the way for other manuscripts currently held in different archives to be reattributed to Ravenna. We know for sure that manuscripts were copied in Ravenna. Liturgical books like the very impressive Roll, Bibles for use in church, copies of the antiphons in both Greek and Latin, as well as legal documents written in a more cursive script. But very few survive in the city itself. The papyri are scattered throughout European and American libraries. Most records in Gothic, like this Bible, were systematically destroyed when the Arian Christians were obliged to hand over their churches to the Catholics in the 560s. While the Mundi Scriptura was carefully produced in an established monastic scriptorium with regular letter forms and abbreviations, the script of the contemporary Ravenna Vitas Patrum is clumsier but recognizable. 2 further aspects of the Ravenna Cosmographer merit comment. The first is the addition of a periclus to his text. This starts from his own city, Ravenna, sadly not marked on the map, but you know where it is. And he sets this at the center of the world. And he moves anti-clockwise from Ravenna, around the sea, giving priority to the Adriatic port where he lived. This is in contrast to most of the peripli of the Mediterranean, which start at Cadiz, at the Pillars of Hercules, and then move in a clockwise fashion. The second unusual feature is the circumnavigation of the Black Sea, for which the Anonymous may possibly have used Arrian as a guide. As governor of Cappadocia from 131 to 137, Arrian had responsibility for defending the province from invading tribes like the Alans, called Massagetae. This is a map of the chief sites named in Arrian's 2nd century Black Sea Periclus, which he sent to the Emperor Hadrian. I've tried to compare it with the Anonymous, who adds the names of all the sites encircled in red. These names do not feature in the 2nd century account. Where did the Anonymous find them? Could they possibly have been derived from sources available in Ravenna? This raises the question of the Gothic component in the Cosmography of the Ravenna Anonymous, which is based on his alleged reliance on 3 Gothic geographers, Marcomerus, Ildebarus, and Athanarich. No individuals with these names are recorded elsewhere, and several experts suggest that they are invented. The Anonymous is heavily reliant for his information about the Goths on the writings of Jordanes and Isidore of Seville, which were available in Ravenna, and the Gothic geographers are not explicitly cited very often. But he was aware of the Gothic history of the city, the mausoleum of Theodoric, the church foundations identified by his monogram, and the large equestrian statue that stood in front of his palace, a building which was later adapted for use by the Constantinopolitan exarchs. While the Gothic language was no longer understood, the history of Theodoric's rule was still integral to the city's history. Even if Marcomir, Hildebald, and Athanarich are mere names, they represent a living element in the Anonymous universe. And their presence in 8th century Ravenna can be traced, somewhat negatively, in the reuse of parchment as the ability to read Gothic diminished. Recently, the discovery of Gothic texts under later records has stimulated a wider search for material dating from the time of Theodoric and his daughter Amalasuintha. In the 7th and 8th centuries, when few could decipher Gothic, the parchments were scraped for reuse. We've already seen the famous example found on 4 folios of the Codex Carolinus with the text of Isidore of Seville. This is another example, this time of a Gothic Latin Bible, reused again for Isidore's writings. The Gothic is on the left column and the Latin on the right. You can just see the 3 top lines, which are quite clearly written in a language which is neither Greek nor Latin. Now, Massimiliano Bassetti has also identified several palimpsest manuscripts with Gothic underscript in the archive of the Cathedral of Verona, which he believes were originally written in Ravenna and reused in later centuries. Other fragments of Gothic biblical texts are also preserved in the Ambrosiana Library in Milan and in Bologna, where Carla Fagliomini has found new texts, including the first reference in Gothic to the word lion. These are more palimpsests from Verona. Finally, what did the Anonymous's map look like? With his access to so many books, probably a copy of the Tabula Portingeriana and other aids, he constructed a map noted at the end of Book 1. He may have known the elegant illustrations to Cosmas's, we only have the ones preserved in an 8th, 9th century copy in the Vatican, see here, or the 10th century one in Florence. But when his work was incorporated wholesale into the Cosmography of Guido of Pisa, this was the map that accompanied the text. It's a very basic outline. So basic that you wonder whether it's really very helpful at all. But nonetheless, that is the world map in the manuscript of 1119. It is very similar, this map, to the Albi map. With his cosmography, the Anonymous of Ravenna was looking forward to the new world that would be dominated by Christian faith. But at the very time of its composition, Islam was claiming to be the third and final revelation of the one God to the Arabs in their own language. While the Anonymous does not mention the Arabs, we know the outcome of their conquests. They divided the Mediterranean world into 3, dominated by monotheistic religions. Here is the Albi map on its side to show its similarity with those of Cosmas and Guido. This is the period I would like to rename early Christendom rather than late antiquity, the time when early Islam and Babylonian Judaism established their own definitions of what is correct belief in the one God. All these 7th to 9th century inhabitants based their intellectual activity on the achievements of the ancient Greeks. But their aims were to create new worlds to surpass antiquity and establish their own cults. Of course, they still read the mysteries of Hermes Trismegistus, practiced divination and sorcery to predict the weather or to obtain a male child. These issues were so complex that every assistance, however heretical, continued to be employed. But they were all in the process of building a new world, one that gave them confidence in their own interpretation of the monotheistic scriptures and the means to criticize those who disagreed with them. In this palimpsest from Sinai, an Arabic translation of the Gospels has replaced a medical text illustrated with herbal recipes from plants. Something distinctive and intrinsically syncretic emerged in the West, with highly motivated competing centres of power that shared a Latin-speaking Christian priesthood, traditions of Roman law, engineering and administration, and the distinct energies of the Germanic and Gothic tribes. The synthesis that I've been tracing has to be tested by further research in the surviving sources for hints, asides, implications that can be investigated to support it. And I think the anonymous deserves a lot more attention. In conclusion, I'd like to stress 3 aspects. These cosmographies allow us to see a synthesis being constructed during the period between Theodoric and Charlemagne. It's not proof, but it demonstrates a visible process at work. Here is the reuse of San Vitale's octagonal construction in its Carolingian form. Second, this synthesis occurred in Ravenna and elsewhere. The capital of the Exarchate was not the only place. 3, but Ravenna was distinguished by a mixed form of rule, secular and religious, Constantinopolitan and local, that allowed the space for the anonymous to do his research. Perhaps this was the greatest gift of Byzantium, which prevented Islam from replacing Christianity in the West and allowed the post-Roman kingdoms time to find their own autonomy, leading eventually to Charlemagne. Hailed as Emperor of the Romans by Pope Leo III in 800. Let's not fetishize the year 800. Dates are often as misleading, I think, as strict periodization. Possibly a more lasting shift occurred in around 843, when the Empress Theodora restored icon veneration in Byzantium, and Charlemagne's grandsons divided up his empire by the Treaty of Verdun. In the Muslim world, Caliph al-Mutasim died in 842, the last Abbasid ruler with any serious authority. So this might possibly be a date to choose for the ending of early Christendom and early Islam, and the beginning of new phases in all 3 areas of the Roman world. Thank you very much.